The global superstar labeled a national threat, mind control experiments, a religious leader secretly on the CIA's payroll. Some cover-ups are so unbelievable they sound like something out of a Hollywood thriller. But these? They're the real deal. On today's episode of The Infographic Show, we're uncovering secret cover-ups so unbelievable they seem fake. Get ready for jaw-dropping stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Number 23. Acoustic Kitty, the CIA's catastrophe. In the 1960s, the CIA thought, why not use cats to spy on the Soviets? Yeah, really. Enter Acoustic Kitty, the brilliant project designed to turn felines into covert agents. The plan was to implant microphones and transmitters into the cat's body, transforming it into a secretive, furry spy that likes snuggles. Because when you think of stealth and intelligence gathering, you think cat. The CIA went all in, spending $20 million to surgically implant gadgets into these unsuspecting cats. But as you might guess, the execution didn't quite live up to the vision. The first mission sent a cat to eavesdrop on two men outside the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. But in a plot twist more tragic than any spy thriller, the cat was immediately hit by a taxi. Yeah, that's a real-life spy mission gone horribly wrong moment. However, in 2013, a CIA official claimed that the cat actually survived, and it lived out its days in peace, meaning that while the project was a total flop, at least the cat didn't have to die for it. After multiple failed attempts, the project was officially scrapped in 1967. A CIA memo bluntly admitted, it's just not practical, citing one major flaw: cats simply don't care. So after spending millions, the CIA finally learned the hard way that cats aren't exactly cut out for the spy game. Who could have guessed? Number 22. The Fruit Machine, Canada's bizarre attempt to test who is gay. In 1961, at the peak of the Cold War, the Canadian government wasn't just worried about spies and nuclear fallout, they were also concerned about who you were attracted to. So naturally, they hired Carleton University professor Frank Robert Wake to develop a scientific method for determining whether someone was gay. After all, in the paranoid McCarthy-era climate, being gay was considered just a step away from being a communist sympathizer. Apparently, nothing screams national security threat, quite like who you want to sleep with. Wake, a psychology chair and evidently a fan of questionable science, was paid by the Canadian government to travel to the US and study detection devices. When he returned, he whipped up one of the least functional ideas in history, the Fruit Machine. Despite its name, it was actually a set of psychological tests that supposedly measured how a person's pupils dilated when shown naked pictures of men and women. That's right, the Canadian government actually thought that they could track eye movement to determine if someone was secretly gay. Unsurprisingly, it didn't work. The Fruit Machine was abandoned, and not before hundreds of LGBTQ Canadians had their careers ruined. People were fired or demoted from their government jobs, especially in the military and civil service, simply for being suspected of something they could not control. Now, decades later, Carleton University students are determined to make sure that this dark chapter isn't forgotten. They're calling for the school to issue an official apology for Wake's bizarre experiment. Maybe even put up a monument as a reminder of how not to conduct science. In 2017, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued a sweeping apology to those who were caught up in the Gay Purge, and the government offered a settlement to the survivors. The Fruit Machine may not have worked, but it sure did sour a lot of lives. Number 21. Operation Sea Spray, the Navy's accidental germ party. In 1950, the U.S. Navy wanted to know just how vulnerable a city might be to a bioweapon attack. So naturally, they decided the best way to find out was to secretly test biological warfare on an unsuspecting American city. They unleashed a bacterial storm over San Francisco, expecting to gather valuable data, and, well, it didn't exactly go according to plan. Between September 20th and September 27th of that year, the Navy released Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigi bacteria into the air over San Francisco. In the process, they accidentally exposed around 800,000 residents to their secret biological experiment. 1 week later, 11 unsuspecting patients arrived at Stanford Hospital with mysterious urinary tract infections. One of them, Edward Nevin, didn't make it. His heart valve failed under the strain of this bacterial surprise. And in classic government fashion, the Navy didn't bother warning health authorities before launching their uninvited little germ party. In 1977, the Army finally fessed up the whole ordeal when the Senate got curious. They dismissed any connection between their experiment and the subsequent pneumonia outbreak, but the whole thing remained shady. In 1981, Nevin's family sued the government, but courts didn't see a clear connection to the Navy's mishap. So just like the bacteria, the case was swept under the rug. Number 20. Operation Northwoods, How to Wage War on Cuba. The 1950s and 60s were a wild time for the US government conspiracies, but Operation Northwoods might just take the cake for the most outlandish. In 1962, the CIA came up with a plan so absurd it could have been ripped straight from a bad spy thriller. The idea? Stage terrorist attacks on American citizens and military targets in places like Miami and Washington. Then blame it on Cuba to drum up public support for going to war. Nothing says good diplomacy like faking a war. The plan was as insane as it sounds. Innocent people and soldiers would be killed, US ships and Cuban refugee boats would be blown up, airplanes would be hijacked, and then fake evidence would be planted to make sure the Cuban government took the fall. And just who was in on this genius plan? The Joint Chiefs of Staff. They were so on board they presented it to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. But then, like a sane person in a room full of lunatics, President John F. Kennedy stepped in and said, "Yeah, let's not do that." Of all the things JFK is remembered for, this might just be the one we should be the most thankful for. Number 19. Project Overcast. Nazi scientists find employment in America. In 1945, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency decided the best way to keep America ahead of the game in the post-war world was to recruit a bunch of Nazi scientists, technicians, and engineers. Over 1,500 of them to be exact. President Truman was on board with the plan, with one tiny caveat. The scientists had to be not a member of the Nazi Party and more than a nominal participant in its activities. Simple enough, right? Well, except for a few minor details, like the fact that Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and Hubertus Strughold, some of the most notorious Nazi scientists, were all officially listed as a menace to the security of the Allied forces. But instead of telling them to take a hike, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency decided that these guys were just too valuable to pass up. So they got creative. They cooked up brand new employment and political biographies for these scientists, carefully scrubbing away any inconvenient Nazi affiliations. And just like that, their pasts were all erased and they were ready for a fresh start in America. Why would we let a little thing like being directly involved with a Nazi war machine get in the way of rocket science, right? Number 18. Project Artichoke. The CIA's bizarre failed experiment in mind control. Welcome to the 1950s, when the CIA's idea of a good time was seeing just how far they could mess with people's minds. Project Artichoke was an experiment that had aimed to figure out whether they could turn someone into an assassin on command. Sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, but this was real life. Project Artichoke, originally called Project Bluebird, which doesn't sound quite as ominous, kicked off in 1951, and soon the CIA was tossing around everything from cocaine and peyote to LSD, looking for the perfect mind-altering cocktail. They even kept agents in the dark by secretly dosing them with LSD. One unlucky agent was subjected to 77 days of the stuff. But it wasn't just about getting high. They were trying to figure out how to make people forget things, including their own name and maybe just a little thing called self-preservation. Let's not forget the wildest of them all, turning a person into a human weapon. If hypnosis actually worked, the CIA figured, why not train an assassin to take out a prominent figure, or even a fellow American official? In the end, Project Artichoke was shelved in favor of another brain-bending adventure, which leads us to our next entry. Number 17. MKUltra, the CIA mind control project. The 1950s, where communist spies were everywhere, the Cold War was cranking up, and the Soviet Union seemed like it might just knock American democracy off its high horse. To combat this, there was only one solution. The CIA decided it was time to secretly dose unsuspecting US and Canadian citizens with LSD, hoping that it would somehow lead to the discovery of a truth serum. The CIA was all in. They paid off hospitals, prisons, and universities to participate in this shady experiment, and of course, to keep their mouths shut. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms made the brilliant call to destroy all documents related to the project, just in case anyone started asking too many questions. And while the conspiracy finally came to light in 1975, with more documents being declassified over the years, getting the full story is nearly impossible. Why? Well, because, surprise, nobody involved remembers the details. It's a masterclass in convenient memory loss. Number 16. The 1990 testimony of Nayirah. In October 1990, a 15-year-old girl named Nayirah stood up before the U.S. Congress and delivered what was at the time a gut-wrenching testimony. She claimed that she had witnessed Iraqi soldiers snatching 15 Kuwaiti babies out of incubators before leaving them on the floor. The heart-wrenching story aired on TV stations across the U.S. And if that wasn't enough, President George Bush Sr. repeated it at least 10 times in the weeks that followed, using it as a tool to rally support for the Gulf War. Here's the thing though, none of it was true. It turns out the whole story was a complete fabrication. The CIA had actually asked Nayirah to take acting lessons before her emotional testimony. It also came to light that Nayirah was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the US and worked directly with the Kuwaiti government to drum up US involvement in the Gulf War. The heartfelt testimony was basically a well-orchestrated PR stunt. Amnesty International didn't hold back, calling out the Bush administration for its opportunistic manipulation of the international human rights movement. Because, as it turns out, war propaganda loves a little theatrics, plus a generous helping of deception. Number 15. Operation Snow White, the Church of Scientology versus the U.S. government. In the 1970s, L. Ron Hubbard's Church of Scientology took a bold, brazen approach, embedding operatives within the U.S. government. They deployed a staggering 5,000 covert agents, orchestrating the largest government breach in American history. This was like the Ocean's 11 of cults. Scientologists secretly slid into 136 organizations, including the IRS, the DEA, foreign embassies, and a whole host of other government agencies. Their mission was to protect their church, avoid paying millions in taxes, and maybe steal a few hundred documents here and there. No biggie. But the government wasn't about to just let this slide. In July 1977, the FBI struck back hard, launching a massive raid on Scientology locations with a squad of 156 agents. They uncovered illegal wiretaps, stolen documents, and a whole bunch of conspiracies involving other enemies of the church. By December 6, 1979, Operation Snow White came to an explosive end. Mary Sue Hubbard, L. Ron's wife, and 10 other high-ranking Scientologists were sentenced to 5 years in prison. But as expected, L. Ron Hubbard got off scot-free as an unindicted co-conspirator, meaning that he got to spend the rest of his life hiding out in seclusion while everyone else took the fall. I guess that's the perk of being the founder of a religion. Number 14. CIA Assassinations. In 1975, after the Watergate scandal, Senator Frank Church helped establish the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, aka the Church Committee. Its mission was to ensure the CIA and the FBI weren't acting like rogue agents of chaos. And they were. Not only that, the CIA was even running an underground hitman business. It turns out the CIA had been busy taking out leaders like Mossadegh in Iran, Allende in Chile, and countless others in places like Central and South America, Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Asia. They didn't even break a sweat. Everything was subtle. Deaths were made to look like accidents, suicides, or for the truly dramatic heart attacks and cancers. If a little subtlety wasn't enough, they also had the handy heart attack gun, just to make things go smoother. And if all else failed, well, they were perfectly happy to just pull out a gun and do things the traditional way. Even though this is officially documented in the congressional record, people still laugh it off like some tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. Because why would an agency built on global surveillance and secrecy ever have a side hustle in assassinations? Number 13. The Business Plot. Fascism in America. In 1933, Senator Prescott Bush, father of George Bush Sr. and grandfather of George W. Bush, decided to take a hands-on approach to politics. His ambitious idea was to overthrow President Franklin D. Roosevelt and replace him with a nice, cozy fascist dictatorship. The plot had serious financial muscle behind it, with wealthy businessmen from Chase Bank, Goodyear, Standard Oil, GM, and the DuPont family all backing the scheme. To pull off something this audacious, they needed a skilled leader, a master tactician, and there was only one man for the job: Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler. There was just one tiny flaw in their otherwise genius plan. Apparently, nobody bothered to check in if Butler was a fan of fascism. It turns out he wasn't. Butler, a vocal supporter of FDR, wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of a military coup. Instead of going along with it, he gathered all the evidence and took it straight to Congress. The plotters denied everything, and even though the committee confirmed that a plan to overthrow the government did exist, no criminal charges were ever filed. The whole thing was swept under the rug, and the conspirators simply went back to business as usual, maintaining close financial ties with Nazi Germany until the U.S. finally entered World War II. Number 12. Operation Mockingbird, the CIA's propaganda machine. In 1948, Frank Wisner was appointed the director of the Office of Special Projects with one mission: create a propaganda machine that would help the U.S. win the global battle against Soviet communism. Think of it as the CIA's very own PR department, but with a heavy dose of "we'll control the narrative." By the 1950s, the CIA had taken over the office, and for almost 25 years they ran a secret campaign to influence the media worldwide. Wisner didn't just settle for a few friendly media connections. He controlled some of the biggest names in journalism, including the New York Times, Newsweek, and CBS. By the 1950s, around 3,000 CIA employees and countless media outlets were working overtime to keep the propaganda machine running smoothly. In 1954, Wisner even backed the Hollywood animated version of George Orwell's Animal Farm, a not-so-subtle reminder that communism is evil, just in case anyone missed the memo. Then, in 1975, the Church Committee blew the whole operation wide open. It exposed the web of media manipulation, and it revealed that all of this misdirection and propaganda was costing taxpayers $265 million a year. Number 11. CoInTEL Pro, the FBI versus the 1960s activists. The 1960s was a time when the world was finally waking up, with radical social change blooming everywhere. The counterculture was on fire, spreading anti-establishment vibes like wildfire across the Western world. But of course, the FBI wasn't having any of that. So in response, they launched CoInTEL Pro, aka the Counterintelligence Program. What else is a government supposed to do when its own citizens start questioning authority? The FBI claimed it was to protect national security, prevent violence, and maintain the existing social and political order. In other words, illegally crush any group that dared disrupt the status quo. CoInTEL Pro ran from 1956 to 1971, and according to FBI records, its resources weren't primarily focused on protecting national security, but rather on harassing and dismantling organizations advocating for civil rights and social justice. Amongst its top targets were the women's rights movement, the peaceful civil rights movement, and the Congress of Racial Equality, the American Indian Movement, and other so-called threats, also known as groups pushing for justice. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover wasn't exactly subtle about it, ordering agents to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize these movements and their leaders. Number 10. Heart disease smokescreen. Back in the 1960s, the sugar industry funded a sweet little campaign to deflect blame for heart disease from sugar to dietary fat. In 1967, scientists generously funded by the Sugar Research Foundation, now known as the Sugar Association, published a review in the New England Journal of Medicine that conveniently ignored sugar's role in coronary heart disease. They painted fat as the villain while pocketing what would be 50 grand in today's money. Apparently, science is better when it comes with a little sugar. A few decades later, and the sugar industry's playbook has not changed. Recent findings uncovered by a University of San Francisco researcher reveal how sugar-funded science has shaped public health for decades, through backroom deals, manipulated research, and carefully crafted misinformation. Even today, food companies continue to sponsor research, twisting nutrition facts to fit their agenda and turning nutrition science into a tangled mess of confusion. Honestly, it's a wonder anyone knows what's actually good for them. And when faced with the truth, the Sugar Association didn't admit fault. They deflected, dismissing the study as nothing more than anti-sugar propaganda. Number 9. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service teamed up with the Tuskegee Institute to pull off one of the most jaw-droppingly unethical experiments in history. They decided to create a completely fake syphilis treatment program, and then they lied to almost 400 African-American men who had been diagnosed with syphilis, telling them that they were getting treatment when in fact they were part of a twisted research project. Initially, the experiment was supposed to last 6 months, but of course things didn't go according to plan. It took until 1972, 40 years later, for the story to be leaked to the Associated Press, forcing the government to step in and finally shut it down. For 4 decades, these men were treated like guinea pigs, given dangerous chemicals, and forced into painful, unnecessary medical procedures, all in the name of research. Meanwhile, the known cure for syphilis, penicillin, was deliberately kept from them. This was so the researchers could continue their study and learn more about the disease. Eventually, in 1974, a class action lawsuit settled out of court for $10 million plus lifetime health benefits for the surviving participants. Ethically irresponsible doesn't even begin to cover it. Number 8. The Gulf of Tonkan. The attack that took the U.S. to war, sort of. In August 1964, the U.S. Navy found itself in a tense standoff in the Gulf of Tonkan. North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked American destroyers twice, giving President Johnson the perfect excuse to escalate the Vietnam War. Except the second attack never actually happened. It was completely fabricated. On August 2nd, the USS Maddox did get into it with the North Vietnamese boats. Shots were fired, people got hurt. But the second attack, the one that set the stage for the full-blown war, was just bad intel. The Navy, convinced that they were being ambushed, misinterpreted radar signals and sent out a defensive response. But Captain John Herrick, the guy on the ground, later admitted doubts about the whole thing. Still, the Johnson administration, eager to ramp up the war machine, ran with it, using the attack to push through the Gulf of Tonkan resolution. This gave the president the power to escalate the military presence in Vietnam. No declaration of war needed. It wasn't until years later that the truth came out. The second attack never even happened. It was nothing more than a radar glitch in a case of overeager sonar operators, but by then the damage was done. The Gulf of Tonkin incident had already served as the perfect excuse to launch a war that would drag on for years, costing countless lives, all built on a manufactured crisis. It may sound like a crazy conspiracy. It's a stark reminder of how easily history can be shaped by a lie, and how devastatingly expensive those lies can be. Number 7. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The full plot unfolded. The classic tale is John Wilkes Booth acted alone when he shot President Lincoln at Ford's Theater. But in reality, Booth had a whole team of conspirators with 9 others involved, including Mary Surratt, the first woman to be executed by the United States government. Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, was quickly pursued by Union forces after the assassination, leading to a 12-day manhunt across Maryland and Virginia. He was eventually cornered at the Garrett Farm, where Union cavalry set fire to the barn and shot him dead as he tried to escape. The rest of the conspirators met varying fates. David Harold, a dim-witted pharmacy clerk, was hanged after he led Booth on the escape route. George Astaroth, who had been tasked with killing Vice President Johnson, lost his nerve and ended up at the bar instead, and he was also executed. Lewis Powell, a former Confederate POW, was tasked by John Wilkes Booth with assassinating Secretary of State William Seward. Powell broke into Seward's home, injuring him and several others in a brutal attack. Despite his efforts, Seward survived and Powell was captured. He was tried and hanged for his role in the conspiracy. Mary Surratt, who hosted conspirator meetings at her boarding house, became the first woman executed by the U.S. for her role. Michael O'Laughlin, Booth's childhood friend, ended up with a life sentence but died in prison from yellow fever. Samuel Arnold, another friend of Booth's, was tied to the original kidnapping plan and was later pardoned. Dr. Samuel Mudd, who helped Booth by setting his broken leg after the assassination, avoided hanging by a single vote, but spent life in prison before being pardoned. Edmund Spangler, a stagehand at Ford's Theater, was sentenced to 6 years for assisting Booth, but was also pardoned later. And John Surratt, Booth's right-hand man and Confederate spy, fled after the assassination. He spent years as a fugitive in Europe before being caught in Egypt, but was acquitted in court and survived until 1916. Together, these conspirators played a key role in the most infamous assassination in U.S. history. Number 6. The CIA helped fund the Dalai Lama. Back in the 1960s, the CIA allegedly funneled millions to the Tibetan resistance, launching a nearly 2-decade-long covert operation aimed at destabilizing the Chinese government. Using Tibet as their battleground, the agency coordinated with the Dalai Lama's brothers, who at first kept him in the dark. They poured millions into political propaganda and paramilitary efforts to keep the dream of Tibetan autonomy alive, both in the hearts of Tibetans and on the global stage. The CIA didn't just throw money at resistance groups, they built an entire paramilitary force of about 2,000 men on the Nepalese border. By 1964, the price tag for all of this covert chaos was over $1.7 million a year. Some say even the Dalai Lama himself was getting $180,000 annual salary, though he denied it. But when Nixon made nice with China in 1972, the program was shut down, leaving the Dalai Lama calling out the CIA for what he saw as ulterior motives. So much for helping the Tibetan people. Number 5. Project Sunshine. The government's sneaky search for fallout's damage. Back in the 1950s, the US government wasn't just testing nukes, it was testing people. Project Sunshine was a secret mission to determine how radioactive fallout was affecting the world. And how did they do it? By harvesting the bones of the dead, including babies. Yeah, you heard that right. In 1955, physical chemist and future Nobel Prize winner Dr. Willard Libby jokingly referred to body snatching, and suddenly the project had over 1,500 cadavers, mostly children collected from across the globe. No consent, no warning, just bones. The truth didn't come out until years later, when one British mother discovered that her stillborn child's legs had been shipped off to the US without her ever knowing. But they weren't just into body parts. They took their radioactive obsession to Belgium, testing the soil, the grass, even cows to see how strontium-90 was contaminating the food chain. Number 4. The Tobacco Coverup. For decades, smoking was sold as the cure for everything. Just ask the doctors who recommended it. Cigarettes were everywhere – cartoons, TV shows, movies, even comic books. And for years, the public bought into it, happily puffing away while tobacco companies kept pushing their health benefits. Then the 1950s came, and the truth started to leak out. Cigarettes were a one-way ticket to cancer. But did Big Tobacco fess up? Of course not. Instead, they buried their research and doubled down on their lies, keeping the public in the dark, while their own studies screamed, "This stuff kills!" It wasn't until 2000 that Philip Morris finally admitted they had known all along. By then, though, millions had already paid the price with their health. Number 3. Unleaded gas. You probably have filled your car with unleaded gas without a second thought, right? Well, that term isn't just a label, it is the end result of a massive cover-up by the oil and gas industry. Lead, once added to gasoline to reduce engine knock, is a deadly neurotoxin that affects brain development, lowers IQ, and it increases aggression, especially in children. But the industry knew the dangers as early as the 1900s and they buried the truth. A 1920 study confirmed the risks, but the findings were kept hidden while they continued selling leaded gas to millions. By the 1970s, the US finally introduced unleaded gasoline after acknowledging its catastrophic health effects. But that didn't stop Ethel and Octel from pushing leaded gas in Eastern Europe and developing nations for another 14 years. Studies now show that lead exposure from gasoline contributed to higher crime rates, developmental disorders, and even long-term economic damage. And honestly, it may have caused even more harm than the tobacco industry's decades of deception. Number 2. Bohemian Grove, the rich, the powerful, and the giant stone owl. Bohemian Grove is a destination like no other, a secluded retreat where the world's most powerful men gather to engage in totally normal activities. You know, like pagan rituals and worshipping a giant stone owl. Sounds like a bad acid trip, right? But no, it is very real, and it's been fueling conspiracy theories for decades. Every year, these wealthy elites head to the woods of Monterey, California, where they perform strange ceremonies and even play voice recordings of none other than Walter Cronkite. It's just your regular, average getaway, with a dash of occult thrown in for good measure. CBS, NBC, and ABC have all confirmed that Bohemian Grove is very real. Established in 1872, the Bohemian Club quickly became a playground for wealthy businessmen. By 1942, the Grove even hosted a little get-together for the Manhattan Project. You know, the one that led to the invention of the atomic bomb. But let's not get too bogged down in history. These days, the Grove is less about world-changing decisions and more about powerful men behaving like frat boys, guzzling alcohol and pretending to be part of some ancient secret society. All while a giant stone owl silently judges them. Okay, maybe that is a little weird. But honestly, what else would you expect from a bunch of billionaires in the woods? Number 1. The FBI versus John Lennon. Spying on peace. So in 1971, when John Lennon arrived in New York on a fresh visa and started mingling with anti-war activists, the FBI took notice. To millions of fans, Lennon was a musical icon preaching peace. But to the Nixon administration, he was a dangerous agitator with a global platform and a growing influence over America's youth. With Vietnam War protests escalating, the White House saw Lennon's anti-war stance as a direct threat, especially since he was openly supporting activists like the Youth International Party, nicknamed the Yippies, who planned to disrupt Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. So the FBI tapped his phone, monitored his mail, tracked his movements, and compiled a detailed surveillance file on him. They even bugged his apartment and had informants attend his gatherings to report on his activities. And as if constant surveillance wasn't enough, the Immigration and Naturalization Service was weaponized against him, launching a full-scale effort to revoke his visa and deport him. All because a former Beatle dared to imagine a world without war. The FBI was out to stop him and peace at all costs. But Lennon refused to back down. He fought a 4-year legal battle to stay in the U.S., eventually winning his green card in 1976. By then, Nixon was out, and the war was winding down, but the case proved how far the government was willing to go to silence a voice for peace. Which of these secret cover-ups shocked you the most? Do you think there are even bigger conspiracies out there that we still don't know about? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out 50 insane declassified FBI secrets you didn't know, or click on this video instead.